I always felt dizzy after dinner. Last night, I hid the food my wife cooked and faked being unconscious. When she made a call thinking I was out, the words I heard made me break inside. My name's Marcus Hale, and let me tell you something. I used to think the worst thing that could happen to a guy was getting caught watching reality TV or admitting you actually enjoyed a Taylor Swift song. Boy, was I wrong. Turns out, the worst thing that can happen is realizing your loving wife has been slowly turning your brain into scrambled eggs for 3 solid months, and you've been sitting there like a grateful idiot saying, "Thank you, honey," after every meal. For 3 months straight, I'd been feeling like a drunk sailor stumbling around the deck of his ship every single night after dinner. Not before dinner. Oh no, that would have been too obvious. Not during lunch. That might have interfered with my work performance too early in her little game. Nope, it was always the same timing, like clockwork. About 30 to 40 minutes after Claudia served me these elaborate, Instagram-worthy dinners that looked like they belonged in some fancy food magazine. And man, did she play the part of the perfect wife. Every night, there she was in our kitchen that cost more than most people's cars, humming like some kind of domestic goddess while she prepared these special meals. Fancy salmon that probably cost $40 a pound, artisanal pasta that she claimed came from some boutique Italian place downtown, and these soups that looked like they belonged in a modern art museum rather than on a dinner table. The presentation was always flawless, garnishes positioned just so, colors arranged like she was painting a masterpiece instead of poisoning her husband. Everyone who knew us thought she was the dream wife. My buddies at work would shake their heads with envy whenever I mentioned how Claudia had surprised me with another gourmet meal. "Dude, you're living the life," they'd say. My wife barely remembers to defrost chicken nuggets. Even my mom, who never liked any woman I dated, had started referring to Claudia as that angel you married. If only they knew that angels, apparently, have a real dark side and access to some seriously sketchy chemicals. The thing that really gets me is how long it took me to connect the dots. I mean, I'm not exactly a rocket scientist, but I'm not completely brain dead either. Well, not naturally brain dead, anyway. But when you're dealing with someone who's systematically messing with your neurological functions, your detective skills tend to take a bit of a nosedive. For weeks, I blamed it on work stress, on getting older, on the fact that I'd been putting in long hours on this massive project that could make or break my career. Classic Marcus. Always looking for the complicated explanation when the simple one was staring me right in the face with a sweet smile and a serving spoon. Last night, though, something finally clicked in whatever brain cells were still functioning properly. Maybe it was the way she'd been asking about my presentation schedule a little too casually, or how she'd started suggesting I should take it easy and let someone else handle the big sterling global pitch that I'd been working toward for months. Or maybe it was just that my survival instincts finally managed to override whatever chemical cocktail she'd been serving up with dessert. So I decided to stop being the polite, dizzy husband who stumbled around the house like a walking advertisement for why you shouldn't drink and operate heavy machinery. While Claudia hummed her little angelic tune in the kitchen, and let me tell you, there's something seriously creepy about someone humming while they're essentially drugging you. I executed what I now like to think of as Operation Don't Eat the Poison. I slipped the food into my napkin like I was 5 years old again, trying to hide peas from my mom because they tasted like tiny green balls of sadness. Except instead of peas, I was hiding what I was now pretty sure was my wife's attempt to turn me into a vegetable. The salmon went into the napkin, the fancy pasta followed, and that suspiciously colorful soup that looked like it belonged in a chemistry lab rather than a bowl. Yeah, that got the napkin treatment too. Then came the performance of a lifetime. I threw myself onto our dining room floor like I was auditioning for an Oscar. And I'm talking full commitment here, the kind of dramatic collapse that would make a soap opera actor weep with pride. Crash went my body, smash went the plate, and down I went, supposedly out cold, on our ridiculously expensive hardwood floors that Claudia had insisted we needed because they were sustainable and made from reclaimed barn wood. Ironic, considering she was apparently trying to reclaim my consciousness. The whole time I'm lying there, playing dead like the world's most paranoid possum, my brain is running this completely inappropriate commentary track. I'm thinking, move over, Leonardo DiCaprio, there's a new fake fainting king in town, and he just gave a masterclass in domestic survival theater. I should have charged admission. Hell, I should have sold popcorn. But underneath all the sarcastic mental chatter, I was scared out of my mind. Because if I was right about what had been happening, and the timing was just too perfect to be coincidence, then the woman I'd promised to love, honor, and cherish had been systematically poisoning me for months. And not in some crime of passion, heat-of-the-moment way, but with the kind of calculated, long-term planning that suggested this wasn't just about getting rid of an annoying husband. This was about something bigger, something that involved my work, my project, and probably a whole lot of money that didn't belong to her. So there I was, sprawled out on our reclaimed barnwood floor, listening to Claudia's concerned wife act as she called my name and checked my pulse, all while planning my next move in what had apparently become the most twisted game of chess I'd ever played. The only difference was, in this version, the queen wasn't just trying to capture the king. She was trying to lobotomize him first. Let me rewind this whole nightmare for you, because the setup to my wife's little poisoning operation was actually pretty damn impressive, in a completely psychotic way. 3 months ago, my life was looking like one of those cheesy motivational posters you see in corporate offices. You know, the ones with eagles soaring over mountains and inspirational quotes about reaching for your dreams. Except in my case, it was more like achievement. It's not just a buzzword when you're actually achieving stuff. I'd just landed the promotion I'd been chasing for 2 years. Not just any promotion, mind you, but the kind that comes with a salary bump that actually makes you feel like a real adult instead of someone playing dress-up in business clothes. We're talking about enough money to finally stop checking my bank balance before buying coffee, the kind of financial security that lets you walk into Target without having a panic attack in the home goods section. Along with the promotion came this massive project, Sterling Global, a client so big that landing them would basically set me up for the next decade of my career. It should have been the best time of my life. Hell, it was the best time of my life, at least for about 2 weeks. That's when Claudia suddenly transformed from her usual self. You know, the woman who considered heating up leftover Chinese takeout to be cooking, into some kind of culinary goddess who apparently had been hiding her inner Martha Stewart for our entire marriage. One day I came home to find her in the kitchen, actually using appliances I didn't even know we owned. She was standing there with this apron that I swear I'd never seen before, looking like she'd stepped out of a cooking show, preparing this elaborate salmon dish that had more ingredients than most people use in a week. The presentation was flawless, the timing was perfect, and she served it with this proud smile that made me feel like I was the luckiest guy in America. "I thought we should celebrate your success properly," she said. And I'm sitting there thinking, damn, maybe all those marriage counselors were right about how couples should make more effort for each other. Maybe Claudia was just stepping up her game because she was genuinely proud of what I'd accomplished. Maybe I'd been underestimating my wife's domestic potential all these years. My friends were absolutely losing their minds with jealousy. Every time I mentioned what Claudia had cooked the night before, they'd get this look on their faces like I'd just told them I'd won the lottery and found out I was related to Chris Hemsworth on the same day. "Dude, she's feeding you Michelin star meals every night?" my buddy Jake would say, shaking his head like he couldn't believe his ears. My wife considers it gourmet cooking when she remembers to take the frozen pizza out of the cardboard box before putting it in the oven. Even my co-workers started commenting on it. "Marcus, you're glowing, man," my project partner Dave said one afternoon. "Marriage treating you well?" And honestly, I thought it was. I thought I was living some kind of domestic fairy tale where the hard-working husband gets rewarded with professional success, and a wife who suddenly discovers she's actually Julia Child in disguise. But here's the thing about fairy tales. They're usually based on some pretty dark original stories, and somebody always ends up getting eaten by a wolf or poisoned by an apple. In my case, it was more like poisoned by the apple while thinking you're living in paradise. The dizziness started subtle, like most insidious things do. Just a little lightheadedness after dinner, the kind of thing you might blame on a long day or maybe having one too many cups of coffee. But it got progressively worse, and it followed this pattern that should have been a dead giveaway if my brain hadn't been operating at about 60% capacity thanks to whatever chemical cocktail Claudia was serving up with the evening news. 30 to 40 minutes after every single dinner, like clockwork, my head would start feeling like it was filled with cotton balls soaked in NyQuil. My balance would go to hell, my thoughts would get fuzzy around the edges, and I'd spend the rest of the evening feeling like I was trying to navigate the world through a thick fog. But it was always just dinner, never lunch, Never breakfast, never the snacks I'd grab during the day. Just those beautiful, elaborate, Instagram-worthy dinners that my loving wife was preparing with such care and attention to detail. I blamed everything except the obvious. Work stress was my go-to explanation. After all, landing Sterling Global was a huge deal, and the pressure was intense. Maybe my body was just reacting to the increased responsibility, the longer hours, the weight of knowing that this project could either launch my career into the stratosphere or crash it into the ground like a failed rocket launch. Claudia was more than happy to reinforce this theory, nodding sympathetically whenever I mentioned feeling off balance. "You're working too hard, honey," she'd say, rubbing my shoulders while I sat there feeling like my brain was trying to swim through pudding. "Maybe you should delegate some of the Sterling project. You don't want to burn yourself out." At the time, I thought she was being supportive. Looking back, I realized she was basically suggesting I hand over my career-defining project on a silver platter so she could serve it up to whoever was paying her for industrial espionage with a side of domestic terrorism. The really twisted part was how she played the concerned wife role to absolute perfection. She'd watch me stumble around the house with this expression of genuine worry, like she was just as confused and concerned about my mysterious evening dizzy spells as I was. She'd suggest doctor visits, recommend I cut back on caffeine, even bought me some expensive vitamins that she claimed might help with stress-related symptoms. Meanwhile, she was literally the cause of every single symptom I was experiencing. What really gets me is how she managed to make me feel guilty about the whole thing. Here I was, this successful guy with a promotion and a raise, married to a woman who was suddenly cooking like she was auditioning for the Food Network, and I was complaining about feeling a little dizzy after dinner. I started thinking maybe I was just being ungrateful. Maybe I was looking for problems where none existed because I was too used to things going wrong to accept when they were going right. But they weren't going right, were they? They were going exactly according to someone else's plan, and that someone was sleeping next to me every night, asking about my day, and slowly, methodically turning my brain into mush so she could steal the biggest opportunity of my professional life. Yeah, that's definitely what I call romance. Nothing says, "I love you," quite like systematic neurological sabotage served with a nice wine pairing. If there was an Academy Award for Best Performance by a wife slowly destroying her husband's life while appearing completely innocent, Claudia would have won it hands down, probably with a standing ovation and a tearful acceptance speech about how she owed it all to her loving, trusting, completely oblivious husband. The woman didn't just play the part of the perfect, concerned wife. She inhabited that role like Daniel Day-Lewis preparing for a biopic about domestic devotion with a sinister twist. Every morning started the same way. I'd wake up feeling like my brain had been put through a blender the night before, and there would be Claudia, already dressed and ready for the day, looking at me with these big, concerned eyes that practically screamed, "Loving wife worried about her mysteriously unwell husband." She'd feel my forehead like she was checking for a fever, ask how I slept, and then launch into her daily performance as the world's most attentive spouse. "You look pale, honey," she'd say, tilting her head with just the right amount of worry creasing her perfectly sculpted eyebrows. "Are you sure you're feeling well enough to drive yourself to work?" And like the grateful idiot I was, I'd usually take her up on the offer because, hey, who doesn't want a chauffeur when they're feeling like they've been hit by a truck carrying a load of confusion and brain fog? Those car rides should have been my first real clue that something was seriously wrong with this picture. Claudia, who usually treated driving like an extreme sport and had gotten more speeding tickets than a teenager with a new license, suddenly became the most cautious driver in the history of automotive transportation. She'd drive exactly the speed limit, come to complete stops at stop signs, use her turn signals with religious devotion, and check on me every 30 seconds like I might spontaneously combust in the passenger seat. "How are you feeling? Any dizziness? Do you need me to pull over?" she'd ask, and I'd shake my head and mumble something about being fine, all while thinking that maybe I'd married the most caring woman on the planet. Little did I know that her concern wasn't about my well-being. It was about making sure her walking chemistry experiment made it to work in one piece so she could monitor the effectiveness of her nightly dosing schedule. But the real masterpiece of her performance was the texting campaign. Throughout the day, my phone would buzz with messages from my devoted wife, checking in with the kind of frequency usually reserved for helicopter parents monitoring their kids' first day of summer camp. How are you feeling? Did you eat lunch? Are you having any dizzy spells? Do you need me to bring you anything? At first, I thought it was sweet. Hell, I was practically bragging about it to my coworkers. My wife's been so attentive lately, I'd tell them, showing off the latest concerned text message like it was a love letter. She's always checking up on me, making sure I'm okay. They'd nod and make those appropriate. Ah, that's nice sounds that people make when someone else's relationship appears to be functioning better than their own. But as the weeks went on, the texting started to feel less like concern and more like surveillance. She wanted to know exactly what I ate for lunch, when I ate it, how I felt afterward, what time I'd be home, whether I was working late, who I was meeting with. She framed it all as worry about my health. But looking back, I realized she was basically conducting a scientific study on the optimal timing and dosage for her evening chemical experiments. My assistant Priya was the first person to really call attention to what was happening to me, and God bless her for it, because I was clearly too brain-addled to notice that I was turning into a walking advertisement for why you should never trust your spouse with your food. Priya's got this no-nonsense attitude that comes from growing up as the oldest of 5 kids. She can spot trouble from a mile away, and she's not afraid to point it out even when it's inconvenient. It was after a particularly disastrous client meeting where I'd completely blanked on basic details about a project I'd been working on for weeks. I was sitting in the conference room afterward, trying to figure out why my brain felt like it was operating on dial-up internet speed, when Priya knocked on the door and came in with that expression she gets when she's about to deliver some uncomfortable truth. "Marcus," she said, closing the door behind her and lowering her voice to a whisper, "you're forgetting things. Important things. Basic things. You're acting like my uncle when he accidentally took 2 Ambien instead of 1. She leaned forward, studying my face with the intensity of a medical examiner. "When did this start? Because it's getting worse, and people are starting to notice." That hit me like a punch to the gut, because Priya was right. I had been forgetting things, not just minor details, but major components of projects I'd been working on for months. I'd walk into meetings and feel like I was hearing about these campaigns for the first time, even though I'd been the one who developed the initial concepts. Numbers that should have been burned into my brain were suddenly fuzzy. Client preferences that I'd memorized were gone. It was like someone was selectively editing my professional memory, leaving me with just enough function to show up to work, but not enough to actually be effective at it. The really insidious part was how Claudia reinforced this narrative at home. Every time I mentioned feeling off at work, forgetting something important, or struggling to concentrate, she'd nod with this expression of sympathetic concern that made me feel like I was dealing with some mysterious medical condition rather than systematic poisoning. "You've been under so much stress with this sterling project," she'd say, rubbing my temples while I sat there feeling like my thoughts were swimming through molasses. "Maybe you're pushing yourself too hard. Maybe you should consider letting someone else take the lead on it, just until you're feeling better." She'd say it with such genuine-sounding concern, such loving worry, that I actually started considering whether she might be right. That's the really twisted genius of what she was doing. She wasn't just drugging me. She was gaslighting me into thinking that my deteriorating mental state was my own fault, the result of work stress and overcommitment rather than her nightly chemical cocktails. She was systematically undermining my professional confidence while positioning herself as the caring wife who just wanted me to take better care of myself. The suggestions to step back from the Sterling project started subtle, but became increasingly direct as the weeks went on. "Honey, you know I support your career, but I'm worried about your health," she'd say, usually right after I'd had a particularly bad evening following one of her special dinners. "Maybe you should talk to your boss about reassigning some of the responsibility. There's no project worth destroying your well-being over." At the time, I thought she was being the voice of reason, the loving partner who could see the big picture when I was too close to the situation to be objective. I didn't realize that she was basically trying to talk me into handing over the most important project of my career so she could deliver it to whoever was paying her for corporate espionage with a side order of spousal betrayal. The really sick part was how she managed to make me feel guilty about not taking her advice. When I'd insist that I could handle the project, that I just needed to get through this rough patch, she'd get this hurt look on her face like I was choosing work over our marriage, like I was being stubborn and ungrateful for her concern. "I just want you to be healthy and happy," she'd say, and I'd end up apologizing for being difficult, for not listening to her wisdom, for prioritizing my career over my well-being. Meanwhile, she was literally the reason I was having health problems in the first place. She was creating the crisis and then positioning herself as the solution, like an arsonist who shows up to help fight the fire they started. It was psychological manipulation on a level that would have impressed cult leaders and abusive partners everywhere. But the most damning evidence of how calculated this whole thing was came in the form of her timing. The dizzy spells, the memory problems, the confusion, it all ramped up perfectly in sync with my project timeline. As we got closer to the Sterling presentation, as the stakes got higher and the pressure increased, my symptoms got proportionally worse. It wasn't a coincidence, and it wasn't stress-related deterioration. It was a carefully orchestrated campaign designed to peak right when I'd be most vulnerable, right when stepping away from the project would seem like the reasonable, responsible thing to do. She played that concerned wife role so convincingly that I started believing I was the problem, that I was being reckless with my health, that maybe I really was too stubborn to admit when I needed help. She had me questioning my own judgment, my own capabilities, my own perception of reality. And all the while, she was probably getting progress reports from whoever was paying her, updating them on how close she was to getting me to hand over the keys to my professional kingdom. If there was an Academy Award for Best Performance by a wife slowly destroying her husband's life while appearing completely innocent, Claudia would have won it hands down, probably with a standing ovation and a tearful acceptance speech about how she owed it all to her loving, trusting, completely oblivious husband. The woman didn't just play the part of the perfect, concerned wife. She inhabited that role like Daniel Day-Lewis preparing for a biopic about domestic devotion with a sinister twist. Every morning started the same way. I'd wake up feeling like my brain had been put through a blender the night before, and there would be Claudia, already dressed and ready for the day, looking at me with these big, concerned eyes that practically screamed, loving wife worried about her mysteriously unwell husband. She'd feel my forehead like she was checking for a fever, ask how I slept, and then launch into her daily performance as the world's most attentive spouse. "You look pale, honey," she'd say, tilting her head with just the right amount of worry creasing her perfectly sculpted eyebrows. "Are you sure you're feeling well enough to drive yourself to work?" And like the grateful idiot I was, I'd usually take her up on the offer because, hey, who doesn't want a chauffeur when they're feeling like they've been hit by a truck carrying a load of confusion and brain fog? Those car rides should have been my first real clue that something was seriously wrong with this picture. Claudia, who usually treated driving like an extreme sport and had gotten more speeding tickets than a teenager with a new license, suddenly became the most cautious driver in the history of automotive transportation. She'd drive exactly the speed limit, come to complete stops at stop signs, use her turn signals with religious devotion, and check on me every 30 seconds like I might spontaneously combust in the passenger seat. "How are you feeling? Any dizziness? Do you need me to pull over?" she'd ask, and I'd shake my head and mumble something about being fine, all while thinking that maybe I'd married the most caring woman on the planet. Little did I know that her concern wasn't about my well-being. It was about making sure her walking chemistry experiment made it to work in one piece so she could monitor the effectiveness of her nightly dosing schedule. But the real masterpiece of her performance was the texting campaign. Throughout the day, my phone would buzz with messages from my devoted wife, checking in with the kind of frequency usually reserved for helicopter parents monitoring their kids' first day of summer camp. "How are you feeling? Did you eat lunch? Are you having any dizzy spells? Do you need me to bring you anything?" At first, I thought it was sweet. Hell, I was practically bragging about it to my coworkers. "My wife's been so attentive lately," I'd tell them, showing off the latest concerned text message like it was a love letter. "She's always checking up on me, making sure I'm okay." They'd nod and make those appropriate, "Ah, that's nice" sounds that people make when someone else's relationship appears to be functioning better than their own. But as the weeks went on, the texting started to feel less like concern and more like surveillance. She wanted to know exactly what I ate for lunch, when I ate it, how I felt afterward, what time I'd be home, whether I was working late, who I was meeting with. She framed it all as worry about my health. But looking back, I realized she was basically conducting a scientific study on the optimal timing and dosage for her evening chemical experiments. My assistant Priya was the first person to really call attention to what was happening to me, and God bless her for it, because I was clearly too brain-addled to notice that I was turning into a walking advertisement for why you should never trust your spouse with your food. Priya's got this no-nonsense attitude that comes from growing up as the oldest of 5 kids. She can spot trouble from a mile away, and she's not afraid to point it out even when it's inconvenient. It was after a particularly disastrous client meeting where I'd completely blanked on basic details about a project I'd been working on for weeks. I was sitting in the conference room afterward, trying to figure out why my brain felt like it was operating on dial-up internet speed, when Priya knocked on the door and came in with that expression she gets when she's about to deliver some uncomfortable truth. "Marcus," she said, closing the door behind her and lowering her voice to a whisper, "you're forgetting things. Important things. Basic things. You're acting like my uncle when he accidentally took 2 Ambien instead of 1. She leaned forward, studying my face with the intensity of a medical examiner. "When did this start?" "Because it's getting worse, and people are starting to notice." That hit me like a punch to the gut, because Priya was right. I had been forgetting things, not just minor details, but major components of projects I'd been working on for months. I'd walk into meetings and feel like I was hearing about these campaigns for the first time, even though I'd been the one who developed the initial concepts. Numbers that should have been burned into my brain were suddenly fuzzy. Client preferences that I'd memorized were gone. It was like someone was selectively editing my professional memory, leaving me with just enough function to show up to work, but not enough to actually be effective at it. The really insidious part was how Claudia reinforced this narrative at home. Every time I mentioned feeling off at work, forgetting something important, or struggling to concentrate, she'd nod with this expression of sympathetic concern that made me feel like I was dealing with some mysterious medical condition rather than systematic poisoning. "You've been under so much stress with this sterling project," she'd say, rubbing my temples while I sat there feeling like my thoughts were swimming through molasses. "Maybe you're pushing yourself too hard. Maybe you should consider letting someone else take the lead on it, just until you're feeling better." She'd say it with such genuine-sounding concern, such loving worry, that I actually started considering whether she might be right. That's the really twisted genius of what she was doing. She wasn't just drugging me. She was gaslighting me into thinking that my deteriorating mental state was my own fault, the result of work stress and overcommitment rather than her nightly chemical cocktails. She was systematically undermining my professional confidence while positioning herself as the caring wife who just wanted me to take better care of myself. The suggestions to step back from the Sterling project started subtle, but became increasingly direct as the weeks went on. "Honey, you know I support your career, but I'm worried about your health," she'd say, usually right after I'd had a particularly bad evening following one of her special dinners. "Maybe you should talk to your boss about reassigning some of the responsibility. There's no project worth destroying your well-being over." At the time, I thought she was being the voice of reason, the loving partner who could see the big picture when I was too close to the situation to be objective. I didn't realize that she was basically trying to talk me into handing over the most important project of my career so she could deliver it to whoever was paying her for corporate espionage with a side order of spousal betrayal. The really sick part was how she managed to make me feel guilty about not taking her advice. When I'd insist that I could handle the project, that I just needed to get through this rough patch, she'd get this hurt look on her face like I was choosing work over our marriage, like I was being stubborn and ungrateful for her concern. "I just want you to be healthy and happy," she'd say, and I'd end up apologizing for being difficult, for not listening to her wisdom, for prioritizing my career over my well-being. Meanwhile, she was literally the reason I was having health problems in the first place. She was creating the crisis and then positioning herself as the solution, like an arsonist who shows up to help fight the fire they started. It was psychological manipulation on a level that would have impressed cult leaders and abusive partners everywhere. But the most damning evidence of how calculated this whole thing came in the form of her timing. The dizzy spells, the memory problems, the confusion, it all ramped up perfectly in sync with my project timeline. As we got closer to the Sterling presentation, as the stakes got higher and the pressure increased, my symptoms got proportionally worse. It wasn't a coincidence, and it wasn't stress-related deterioration. It was a carefully orchestrated campaign designed to peak right when I'd be most vulnerable, right when stepping away from the project would seem like the reasonable, responsible thing to do. She played that concerned wife role so convincingly that I started believing I was the problem, that I was being reckless with my health, that maybe I really was too stubborn to admit when I needed help. She had me questioning my own judgment, my own capabilities, my own perception of reality. And all the while, she was probably getting progress reports from whoever was paying her, updating them on how close she was to getting me to hand over the keys to my professional kingdom. Let me tell you about Dr. Howard Lee, because this man deserves his own medical drama series just based on his eyebrows alone. I'm talking about facial hair so expressive, so dramatically animated, that they could probably win an Emmy for Best Supporting Eyebrows in a Medical Mystery. These things had more personality than most people I work with, and they were about to become the unlikely heroes in solving the case of my mysteriously dissolving brain cells. I've been putting off going to see Dr. Lee for weeks, partly because I'm one of those guys who thinks admitting you need medical help is basically the same as admitting defeat, and partly because Claudia kept suggesting that what I really needed was rest, not doctors. You know how doctors are, she'd say with that concerned wife expression that I now realize was about as genuine as a $3 bill. They'll just run a bunch of expensive tests and tell you it's stress. Why don't you just take some time off instead? But after that disaster of a client meeting where I'd stared at a presentation I'd created myself like it was written in ancient hieroglyphics, I finally broke down and made an appointment. Dr. Lee had been my physician for about 8 years, ever since I'd moved to the city, and he was the kind of old-school doctor who actually listened to his patients instead of just typing symptoms into a computer and prescribing whatever the pharmaceutical rep had brought for lunch that day. His office was exactly what you'd expect from a doctor who'd been practicing medicine since before WebMD convinced everyone they were dying of rare tropical diseases. Diplomas covering one wall, medical journals stacked on every surface, and a coffee mug that looked like it had survived several decades of caffeine-fueled late nights. But the real centerpiece of Dr. Lee's office was the man himself, specifically those magnificent eyebrows that seemed to have their own gravitational pull. I walked in there feeling like a fraud, like I was wasting his time complaining about being dizzy when there were probably people in the waiting room with actual medical emergencies. But the moment I started describing my symptoms, those eyebrows went into action like they were preparing for an Oscar-worthy performance. "So, Marcus," Dr. Lee said, leaning back in his chair and steepling his fingers in that way that doctors do when they're about to either solve your problem or deliver devastating news. "Tell me about these dizzy spells. When do they occur? What triggers them? Any patterns you've noticed?" I launched into my well-rehearsed explanation about work stress, the big project, the promotion, all the rational reasons why my brain might be staging a revolt against my continued existence. But as I talked, I watched those eyebrows gradually climb higher and higher up his forehead, like two caterpillars ascending a mountain of skepticism. After dinner, I muttered, rubbing my temples in what had become my signature move over the past few months. They always happen after dinner, usually about 30 to 40 minutes after I finish eating. And that's when the eyebrows really went to work. They furrowed together in a way that suggested Dr. Lee's brain was processing information at warp speed, connecting dots that I'd been too drugged and distracted to connect myself. He leaned forward, and I swear those eyebrows cast shadows across his entire forehead. "Every dinner?" he asked, and there was something in his tone that made me sit up straighter despite the fog in my head. "Just dinner? Not breakfast, not lunch." "Just dinner," I confirmed, and watched as his eyebrows performed what I can only describe as a dance of medical suspicion. They twitched, they rose, they furrowed, they separated. It was like watching a live-action polygraph test performed entirely through facial hair. Dr. Lee was quiet for a long moment, studying me with the intensity of a detective examining evidence at a crime scene. Then he did something that changed everything. He pulled out an old-fashioned prescription pad and started writing, but not for medication. He was writing instructions. "Marcus," he said, tearing off the sheet and handing it to me like he was passing along state secrets. "I want you to keep a food diary. Everything you eat, when you eat it, how you feel before and after. Times, symptoms, severity. I want details that would make a forensic accountant proud." I looked down at the paper, which contained the kind of meticulous instructions usually reserved for scientific experiments or criminal investigations. A food diary? I asked, probably sounding like a guy who'd just been asked to perform brain surgery on himself. Like, write down everything I put in my mouth. Those eyebrows rose again, this time with what I interpreted as amused patience. Everything, he confirmed. And I mean everything. What you eat, when you eat it, where you eat it, who prepared it. I want you to treat this like you're documenting evidence for a court case. At the time, I thought he was being overly dramatic. Looking back, I realized he was being exactly as dramatic as the situation required, because that's exactly what we were dealing with, a court case in the making, with me as the unwitting victim and my food diary as the key piece of evidence. Doctor, I started, feeling like I needed to justify why I was taking up his time with what seemed like minor digestive issues. Do you really think this is necessary? I mean, it's probably just stress, right? The promotion, the big project, all the pressure. Maybe my body's just reacting too. He held up a hand to stop me, and those eyebrows descended into what I can only describe as their serious business position. Marcus, in 30 years of practice, I've learned that when symptoms follow a pattern this specific, there's usually a specific cause. And when that cause consistently occurs after meals prepared by the same person, he let that sentence hang in the air like a smoke signal spelling out, your wife might be poisoning you. Of course, he didn't actually say that. He was too professional, too careful, too aware that accusing someone's spouse of attempted murder based on eyebrow-transmitted medical intuition might not hold up in court. But the implication was there, hovering between us like an unwelcome dinner guest who'd overstayed their welcome. Just keep the diary, he said, his voice taking on that tone doctors use when they're trying to sound reassuring while secretly preparing for the worst-case scenario. 1 week. Detailed notes. Then come back and we'll review what you've documented. I left his office feeling like I'd just been given homework by the most disappointed teacher in the history of education. The prescription paper felt heavy in my pocket, weighted down with the implication that my mysterious symptoms might not be so mysterious after all. But I also felt something I hadn't experienced in months, hope. Hope that there might be an explanation for what was happening to me. Hope that I wasn't losing my mind or my professional capabilities. Hope that whatever was wrong might actually be fixable. The walk to my car felt different somehow, like I was seeing my life from a new angle for the first time in months. The fog in my brain was still there. The dizziness was still lurking around the edges of my consciousness. But now I had a mission. I had a scientific approach to figuring out what the hell was happening to me. I sat in the parking lot for a few minutes, staring at Dr. Lee's instructions and thinking about those eyebrows and what they might have been trying to tell me. There was something about the way he'd asked about dinner specifically, something about his emphasis on who prepared it, that suggested he already had suspicions about what my food diary was going to reveal. The drive home was interesting, because for the first time in months, I wasn't just a passive victim of whatever was happening to my neurological system. I was an investigator, a detective gathering evidence, a scientist conducting an experiment with my own life as the subject. It was terrifying and empowering at the same time. When I got home, Claudia was in the kitchen again, humming that same angelic tune while she prepared what I now realized was probably another installment in her ongoing chemistry experiment. "How did the doctor visit go, honey?" she asked, turning to me with that expression of loving concern that I was starting to recognize as her default mask. "He wants me to keep a food diary," I said, watching her face carefully for any reaction that might give away her game. "Write down everything I eat for a week, track my symptoms, see if we can identify any patterns." For just a split second, and I mean the tiniest fraction of a moment, something flickered across her face. It wasn't concern or curiosity or supportive interest. It was something else entirely, something that looked suspiciously like panic quickly covered by a smile. "That sounds like a good idea," she said, but her voice had a slight edge to it that hadn't been there moments before. "I'm sure it'll show that you're just working too hard and need to cut back on the stress." That night, as I started my first food diary entry, documenting every ingredient in Claudia's latest culinary masterpiece, I couldn't shake the feeling that Dr. Lee's eyebrows had been trying to save my life. And maybe, just maybe, they were about to succeed. Let me tell you about the most depressing homework assignment of my adult life. a food diary that basically doubled as a criminal evidence log documenting my wife's systematic attempt to turn my brain into pudding. Dr. Lee's instructions were more detailed than a NASA launch checklist, and following them felt like conducting a forensic investigation into my own slow-motion poisoning. For the first few days, I approached it like the dutiful patient I thought I was being. I wrote down every single thing that passed my lips: the time I ate it, where I got it, who prepared it, how I felt before, during, and after. I documented my morning coffee, fine, my lunch meetings, totally normal, my afternoon snacks, no problems, and then came the evening entries that started reading like a medical mystery novel written by someone with a really dark sense of humor. Day 1. 7:30 p.m., dinner prepared by Claudia. Pan-seared halibut with lemon caper sauce, wild rice pilaf, roasted asparagus. 8:15 p.m., slight dizziness beginning. 8:30 p.m., moderate disorientation, difficulty following TV plot. 9 p.m., significant brain fog, stumbled getting up from couch. Day 2. 7:45 p.m., dinner prepared by Claudia. Beef tenderloin with red wine reduction, garlic mashed potatoes, sautéed spinach. 8:20 p.m., dizziness onset. 8:45 p.m., confusion, couldn't remember client name during phone call. 9:15 p.m., severe disorientation, went to bed early. By day 3, even my drug brain was starting to see a pattern that was more obvious than a neon sign in Times Square. But the real revelation came when work kept me late and I grabbed dinner at the office instead of coming home to Claudia's culinary chemistry set. That night, I felt sharp, clear-headed, like someone had cleaned the windows in my brain, and suddenly I could see the world in high definition again. I stayed up until midnight working on the Sterling presentation, my thoughts flowing like they hadn't in months. I was remembering details, making connections, coming up with creative solutions that had been completely beyond my reach for weeks. I wrote in my diary, 8 p.m., dinner from office cafeteria. Turkey sandwich, chips, apple. No symptoms, no dizziness, no confusion. Brain functioning normally for first time in months. The next morning, I felt like I'd been given a temporary reprieve from whatever neurological prison I'd been living in. Colors seemed brighter, sounds were clearer, and I could actually remember why I'd been excited about the Sterling project in the first place. It was like being reminded of who I used to be before my wife started her little pharmaceutical experiment. But here's where things got really interesting. And by interesting, I mean absolutely terrifying in a way that made me question everything I thought I knew about my marriage. When I got home that night, Claudia was already in full concerned wife mode, asking about my late night at the office, wondering if I'd eaten properly, suggesting that maybe I should let her make me something more substantial than whatever junk I'd probably grabbed at work. You know that processed food isn't good for you, especially when you're already feeling unwell, she said, bustling around the kitchen with the kind of determined efficiency that I now realize was less about nutrition and more about getting me back on her dosing schedule. Let me make you something healthy, something that'll help you feel better. For the first time in months, my brain was functioning well enough to recognize manipulation when I heard it. The way she emphasized feeling unwell, like it was my natural state rather than something that mysteriously coincided with her cooking. The way she positioned herself as the solution to a problem that I was starting to suspect she was creating. That's when I made the decision that probably saved my career and possibly my life. I started implementing what I now call the Great Napkin Food Disposal Operation. It required the kind of covert skills usually reserved for international espionage, but desperate times call for creative measures, and I was nothing if not desperate to prove my growing suspicions. The logistics were more complicated than you might think. Claudia had this annoying habit of watching me eat with the attention of a scientist monitoring a lab rat, so I had to get creative. I'd pretend to be really interested in whatever was on TV, turning my body slightly away from her while I slipped portions of food into my napkin. I'd excuse myself to use the bathroom and flush the evidence down the toilet like I was disposing of classified documents. I started carrying larger napkins, wearing jackets with bigger pockets, and developing an Oscar-worthy performance of enthusiastic eating while actually consuming as little as possible. The neighbor's cat became an unwitting accomplice in my operation. Mrs. Henderson's tabby, Mr. Whiskers, started getting gourmet meals that were probably better than what most humans eat. I'd step out to check the mail and dump Claudia's latest culinary creation into his food bowl, watching this ordinary house cat feast on what was probably $40 a pound salmon with artisanal garnishes. Within a week, Mr. Whiskers looked like he'd been training for a sumo wrestling competition. I swear that cat gained about 10 pounds and started walking around the neighborhood with the swagger of someone who'd just discovered they were actually royalty. Meanwhile, I was finally starting to lose the brain fog that had been my constant companion for months. But Claudia noticed. Of course she noticed. When you're systematically monitoring someone's neurological decline, you tend to pay attention when they start showing signs of improvement. "You're losing weight, Marcus," she said one morning, studying my face with the intensity of a medical examiner. "Are you eating enough? You barely touched dinner last night." The way she said it made my skin crawl, because there was something almost accusatory in her tone, like I was being irresponsible by not consuming enough of whatever she was serving up. It wasn't the concern of a loving wife worried about her husband's appetite. It was the frustration of someone whose carefully planned experiment was being disrupted by an uncooperative test subject. "I'm eating fine," I said, which was technically true since I was eating, just not her food. "Maybe I'm just stressed about the presentation." She nodded, but I could see the wheels turning behind her eyes. That afternoon, the concerned text messages ramped up to a level that would have made helicopter parents seem hands-off. "How are you feeling? Did you eat lunch? You seem tired this morning. Maybe you should come home early and rest." But the real test came 3 days later when I decided to eat one of her dinners completely, just to confirm what I already knew in my gut. I needed to be absolutely certain before I did anything drastic, and despite everything, part of me was still hoping that I was just being paranoid, that my wife wasn't actually trying to poison me for corporate espionage purposes. So I ate every bite of her herb-crusted chicken with roasted vegetables and quinoa salad. I complimented the seasoning, asked for seconds, and played the role of the grateful husband enjoying his wife's cooking. Within 35 minutes, my brain was back in that familiar fog, my balance was shot, and I was stumbling around our house like a drunk person trying to pretend they're sober. But this time I was ready. I had my phone discreetly recording everything, documenting not just my symptoms, but also Claudia's behavior as I deteriorated. Through the haze of whatever chemical cocktail she'd served with dinner, I watched her watch me with the clinical detachment of a researcher observing the effects of a controlled substance. And then I heard something that made my blood run cold despite the drugs coursing through my system. The sound of her high heels clicking purposefully across our hardwood floors, heading toward my home office where my laptop was charging. The laptop that contained every file, every presentation, every strategic document related to the Sterling Global project. My phone was still recording when I heard her voice, low and cold, completely different from the concerned wife act she'd been performing for months. She was on a call, speaking to someone in the tone of a business transaction rather than casual conversation. "He's out," she said, and even through my drug-induced haze, I could hear the satisfaction in her voice. "Deeper than usual tonight. I can grab the files now. The transfer better be ready for tonight, like we discussed." I may have been drugged, but I wasn't completely stupid. Even with my brain operating at about 30% capacity, I understood that my loving wife had just confirmed that she was stealing my work while I was incapacitated by whatever she'd been putting in my food for months. This wasn't about concern for my health or stress management. This was about corporate espionage with a side of domestic terrorism. Lying there on our couch, pretending to be unconscious while my wife ransacked my professional life, I realized that the food diary hadn't just documented a pattern of poisoning. It had documented a carefully orchestrated plan to steal the biggest opportunity of my career, one precisely timed dose at a time. The only question now was what I was going to do about it. And despite the chemicals making my thoughts sluggish and my coordination non-existent, I was pretty sure that whatever I did, it was going to involve a lot more than just changing my dinner plans. You know that moment in detective movies where the protagonist realizes they need concrete evidence before they can blow the whole case wide open? Well, welcome to my life. Except instead of investigating some elaborate heist or corporate conspiracy, I was trying to prove that my wife had been turning my dinner plate into a chemistry set for the past 3 months. And let me tell you, when you're dealing with someone who's been systematically messing with your neurological functions, gathering evidence requires a special kind of stupidity that I apparently possessed in abundance. I needed proof. Real, undeniable, recorded and take it to court kind of proof. The food diary was compelling, sure, but my wife's dinners make me dizzy isn't exactly the kind of evidence that would hold up in front of a judge, especially when said wife could probably charm her way out of a murder conviction with her concerned spouse routine. I needed to catch her in the act, to document whatever she was doing during those mysterious minutes when I was supposed to be unconscious on the dining room floor. So I came up with what I now refer to as the stupidest smart plan I've ever devised. Saturday night, exactly 48 hours before my make-or-break presentation to Sterling Global. The presentation that could either launch my career into the stratosphere or crash it into the ground like a failed rocket launch. I decided to voluntarily poison myself one more time. Because nothing says good life choices like deliberately ingesting whatever chemical cocktail your spouse has been serving up while secretly recording the aftermath. The plan was simple, which should have been my first clue that it was also incredibly dangerous. I'd eat every single bite of whatever Claudia prepared, let the chemicals do their thing, but this time I'd have my phone set up to record everything that happened while I was supposedly unconscious. I'd finally get to see what my loving wife did during those lost hours when my brain was operating at the level of a broken calculator. Claudia outdid herself that night, probably because she sensed we were approaching the endgame. She prepared this elaborate salmon dish that looked like it belonged in a five-star restaurant, complete with some kind of glaze that shimmered under the dining room lights like it contained actual gold flakes. The presentation was so perfect, so Instagram-worthy, that for a moment I almost felt bad about what I was planning to do. Almost. "You've been working so hard lately," she said, setting the plate in front of me with that smile that I now realized was about as genuine as a politician's campaign promises. "I thought you deserved something special before your big presentation." Yeah, something special, all right. Something specially designed to turn my brain into putting right when I needed it most. But I smiled back and thanked her like the grateful husband I was supposed to be, all while thinking about how this was probably the last meal she'd ever serve me, assuming I survived it. I ate every bite. Every single, beautifully presented, probably expensive, definitely poisonous bite. The salmon was actually delicious, which somehow made the whole thing even more twisted. Here I was, voluntarily consuming what I knew was a chemical weapon, and I had to admit that my wife was a hell of a cook. If she ever got tired of the domestic terrorism business, she could probably open a restaurant. Then came the waiting. 35 minutes, like clockwork. I'd positioned my phone behind a stack of books on the side table, angled so it would capture the dining room and the entrance to my home office. The recording was already running, hidden behind what looked like a casual arrangement of decorative objects that Claudia had probably arranged herself without realizing she was setting up the perfect surveillance system. When the chemicals hit, they hit hard. Harder than they had in weeks, probably because I'd actually consumed the full dose instead of my usual napkin disposal routine. My vision started swimming, my thoughts turned to soup, and my balance went to hell faster than a celebrity's reputation during a scandal. But this time, I was ready for it. This time, I was a voluntary participant in my own chemical interrogation. I let myself fall to the floor with the kind of dramatic flair that would have made a soap opera actor proud, making sure to position myself where the phone could capture everything while still looking like a genuine collapse. The plate shattered exactly like it was supposed to, creating the perfect audio cue for anyone listening from another room. Through the fog of whatever chemical circus was happening in my brain, I heard Claudia's voice calling my name with that perfect note of panic that she'd probably been practicing. Her footsteps clicked across the hardwood floor, and I felt her checking my pulse, probably making sure the dose had been calibrated correctly. She was good, I'll give her that. Even knowing what I knew, her performance was convincing enough that part of me almost believed she was genuinely concerned. But then came the moment I'd been waiting for, the moment that would either vindicate my paranoid suspicions or prove that I'd finally lost my mind completely. Claudia's concerned wife routine lasted exactly as long as it took her to confirm that I was safely unconscious. Then I heard something that chilled me more than any horror movie ever could. The sound of her heels clicking with purpose toward my home office. My laptop. My project files. My Sterling Global presentation that I'd been working on for months. The career-defining pitch that was supposed to happen in less than 2 days. Through the chemical haze that was scrambling my thoughts like eggs in a frying pan, I heard the unmistakable sound of my computer booting up. And then I heard her voice, but not the sweet, concerned tone she used when she thought I was listening. This was different, cold, businesslike, efficient. The voice of someone conducting a transaction rather than caring for their poisoned husband. "He's out," she said, and I realized she was on a phone call. The dose worked perfectly. I can access his files now. The sterling presentation is right here on his desktop, just like you said it would be. Even in my chemically impaired state, I felt a surge of rage, so pure it almost burned through the fog in my brain. Not only had she been systematically poisoning me, but she'd been doing it on someone else's orders. This wasn't some crime of passion or sudden opportunity. This was industrial espionage with a side order of spousal betrayal, and I was apparently worth whatever they were paying her to destroy my career and possibly my life. "The transfer better be ready tonight," she continued, her voice carrying that edge that people get when they're talking about money. "I've been doing this for 3 months, and I want to be done with it. He's getting suspicious, asking too many questions, seeing doctors. We need to finish this before he figures it out." "Too late, sweetheart," I thought through the chemical soup that used to be my cognitive abilities. Way too late. I could hear her clicking through my files, probably copying everything to whatever device she'd brought for the job. My months of work, my innovative campaigns, my strategy for landing the biggest client of my career, all of it being handed over to whatever competitor was paying her to destroy me from the inside. The really twisted part was the timing. In less than 48 hours, I was supposed to walk into that boardroom and present my ideas to Sterling Global. Except now those same ideas would probably be sitting on someone else's desk, polished up and ready to be presented by whatever company was orchestrating this whole operation. As I lay there on my expensive hardwood floors, listening to my wife sell my career to the highest bidder while I was supposed to be unconscious from her chemical cocktails, I realized that I'd stumbled into something much bigger and more dangerous than I'd originally thought. This wasn't just about a cheating spouse or a bad marriage. This was about corporate warfare, and I'd been the unwitting casualty in someone else's business strategy. But here's the thing about being voluntarily poisoned while secretly recording your wife's confession to industrial espionage. It gives you a very specific kind of clarity about what your next move needs to be. Because I wasn't just dealing with domestic betrayal anymore. I was dealing with a criminal conspiracy, and I had just captured the evidence that would either save my career or get me killed, depending on how the next 48 hours played out. Monday night rolled around like the final scene of a really twisted thriller movie, except instead of some Hollywood hero with perfect hair and impeccable timing, you had me. A guy who'd spent the weekend planning the most elaborate fake fainting routine since Shakespeare wrote his death scenes. Less than 48 hours before my career-defining presentation to Sterling Global, I was about to stage what I hoped would be the final performance in Claudia's little chemical theater production. The weekend had been a masterclass in acting normal while secretly planning domestic counter-espionage. I spent Saturday and Sunday pretending to be the same dizzy, confused husband I'd been for months, all while texting Dr. Lee and a detective that my buddy Jake had recommended, Detective Carla Morris, who specialized in corporate crimes and apparently had seen enough cases like mine to know exactly what we were dealing with. Corporate theft with a poisoning component, Dr. Lee had said when I called him with my recorded evidence. "Marcus, this is serious federal crime territory. You need law enforcement involved immediately." Detective Morris had been even more direct when I'd played her the recording of Claudia's phone conversation. "Mr. Hale, what you've documented here is industrial espionage, assault with a dangerous substance, and probably about 6 other felonies I can think of off the top of my head. We need to catch her in the act with enough evidence to make charges stick." So here we were, Monday night, game time. The plan was simple in theory, but terrifying in execution. I'd stage another collapse, let Claudia think she had me knocked out for the count, and then capture her in the act of stealing my presentation files while law enforcement waited outside for my signal. It was like a sting operation, except the bait was my own neurological system and the trap was set in my dining room. Claudia had outdone herself again, probably because she knew this was the final push before my sterling presentation. The meal looked like something you'd see in a magazine spread about romantic dinners. Perfectly seared steak, some kind of fancy potato preparation that probably had a French name I couldn't pronounce, and vegetables arranged like they were posing for their own portrait. If I didn't know she was trying to chemically lobotomize me, I might have actually been impressed. "You must be so nervous about tomorrow," she said, cutting her own steak with the precision of a surgeon. "All that pressure, all those months of work coming down to one presentation. I hope you're not putting too much stress on yourself." "Yeah, the only stress I'm worried about is whether your little chemistry experiment is going to interfere with my ability to text the police when you start ransacking my office," I thought. But what I actually said was, "Just the usual pre-presentation jitters. Nothing I can't handle." She smiled, that sweet, supportive wife smile that I now knew was about as genuine as a unicorn sighting. "Well, just remember that no job is worth destroying your health over. There will always be other opportunities." "Sure, except the opportunity you're talking about involves me handing over my life's work to whatever corporate scumbags are paying you to destroy my career." But I just nodded and took another bite of what I was pretty sure was my final voluntarily consumed dose of whatever cocktail she'd been serving up. The waiting was the worst part. Knowing that in about 35 minutes, my brain was going to turn into chemical soup while I tried to maintain enough consciousness to execute a plan that could either land my wife in federal prison or get me killed. That's not exactly the kind of dinner conversation that leads to romantic evenings. I excused myself to use the bathroom, mainly so I could send a final text to Detective Morris. "Show starting in 30 minutes. Be ready." Her response was immediate. "Units in position. Phone recording active. Evidence chain secured." Evidence chain secured. Like I was some kind of professional spy instead of a guy who'd learned about industrial espionage because his wife had been poisoning him with his dinner. But yeah, everything was secured. My phone was positioned, the recording was active, and I had enough documentation to start my own crime show. When the chemicals hit this time, they felt different somehow. Maybe because I knew exactly what was happening, or maybe because the psychological component of voluntary poisoning adds its own special kind of horror to the experience. My vision started swimming like I was underwater, my thoughts turned to molasses, and my balance disappeared faster than common sense at a political rally. But I'd practiced this. I'd rehearsed the timing, the positioning, the dramatic fall that would convince Claudia I was safely unconscious while still allowing me to maintain enough awareness to signal for help when the time came. It was method acting at its most dangerous, becoming the victim of your own wife's criminal conspiracy while secretly directing the whole production. The plate shattered right on cue, creating that perfect audio signal that said, "Husband down. Coast is clear for felony activities." I let myself sprawl across the hardwood floor like I'd been struck by lightning, making sure to position myself where I could still see the entrance to my office while appearing completely unconscious. Claudia's performance was flawless, as always. The concerned gasp, the rushed footsteps, the gentle checking of my pulse. She could have won awards for her portrayal of the worried wife discovering her mysteriously collapsed husband. If I didn't know she was the one causing these collapses, I might have actually felt grateful for her concern. But then, just like Saturday night, the mask came off the moment she confirmed I was safely out of commission. I heard her heels clicking with purpose across the floor, heard my office door open, heard the familiar sound of my laptop booting up. Through the chemical haze, I managed to fumble for my phone and send the text I'd already prepared. "She's in the office. Go." What happened next was like watching a crime thriller play out in real time. Except I was both the victim and the star witness, lying on my dining room floor while trying not to let the chemical soup in my brain interfere with my ability to enjoy the show. Claudia's voice drifted from my office, cold and businesslike as she made her call to whoever was paying for my career destruction. "He's out cold again. Went down like a rock. I'm accessing his files now. The sterling presentation is right here, just like last time." There was a pause, probably while whoever was on the other end gave her instructions or confirmed payment details. "Their biggest campaign will be ours by morning," she continued, and I could hear the satisfaction in her voice. "He won't even know what hit him until it's too late." My inner sarcasm managed to break through the chemical fog. "Gee, honey, love you too. Hope the money's worth whatever federal prison sentence you're about to earn." That's when I heard the most beautiful sound in the world, sirens. Multiple sirens, getting closer, coming to save my chemically impaired ass and hopefully put an end to the most twisted dinner theater production in the history of marriage. I'd never been so happy to hear off-key police sirens in my life. They sounded like a symphony, like angels singing, like justice finally arriving fashionably late to the party, but ready to make up for lost time. But Claudia heard them too. The clicking of computer keys stopped abruptly, and I heard her sharp intake of breath as she realized that her little operation had just been compromised. "Marcus?" she called, and her voice had lost all pretense of concern. It was sharp now, suspicious, the voice of someone who'd just realized they might have miscalculated. "Game over, sweetheart. Time to face the music, and I hope you like the sound of handcuffs clicking, because that's about to be your new favorite song." Those sirens wailing outside my house were hands down the most beautiful sound I'd ever heard in my life. Better than my favorite song, better than applause after a successful presentation, better than the sweet sound of my boss telling me I got the promotion. They were the audio equivalent of divine intervention, except instead of angels with harps, I had cops with handcuffs coming to arrest my wife for turning our dining room into a chemistry lab. But here's the thing about sirens, they work both ways. While they were music to my ears, they were apparently the sound of impending doom to Claudia, because I heard her voice from my office go from cold and businesslike to sharp and panicked faster than a politician changing positions during election season. "Marcus," she called out, and there was something in her tone that made it clear the concerned wife act was officially over. This wasn't the sweet, worried voice of a woman checking on her mysteriously collapsed husband. This was the voice of someone who just realized their criminal enterprise was about to be shut down by law enforcement, and they needed to figure out damage control immediately. I stayed perfectly still on the dining room floor, which wasn't exactly difficult considering that whatever chemical cocktail she'd served with dinner was still making my brain feel like it was operating on dial-up internet. But I could hear everything. The sirens getting closer, Claudia's sharp intake of breath, the sound of her heels clicking frantically across the hardwood as she tried to figure out what the hell was happening. The smart thing would have been to stay exactly where I was, play dead until the cavalry arrived, and let Detective Morris handle the arrest while I lay there like a victim of circumstance. But apparently, 3 months of being systematically poisoned by your spouse does something to your judgment, because instead of staying put, I decided to turn this into the world's most dangerous game of hide-and-seek. I managed to crawl behind our kitchen island. You know, that ridiculously expensive piece of granite that Claudia had insisted we needed because it was essential for entertaining. Well, it turned out to be pretty essential for hiding from your felonious wife when you're too chemically impaired to stand up straight but still want a front row seat to her arrest. From my position behind the island, crouched down like a terrified ninja with balance issues, I had a perfect view of Claudia's expensive heels as she clicked across the tiles, stepping right over the broken plate from my Oscar-worthy collapse. Through the crack under the cabinets, I could see those shoes that probably cost more than most people's rent, moving with the kind of frantic energy that suggested their owner was having a very bad night. She was moving fast, probably trying to get back to my office to destroy evidence before the police made it inside. But the sirens were getting louder, and I could hear car doors slamming outside, which meant Detective Morris and her team were already positioning themselves around our house, like it was the climax of some crime show. "Marcus, are you okay?" Claudia called out again, but her voice had that edge of desperation that people get when they're trying to maintain a cover story that's falling apart faster than a house of cards in a hurricane. She was still trying to play the concerned wife, but it was like watching someone perform Shakespeare while the theater burned down around them. The clicking of her heels stopped suddenly, and I realized she'd figured out that standing around calling my name probably wasn't the best use of her remaining freedom. I heard her dart back toward my office, probably planning to grab whatever evidence she could and destroy the rest before the police made it through our front door. Bad timing, sweetheart. Really, really bad timing. That's when I heard the most satisfying sound of the entire evening. The front door being kicked in with the kind of authority that only comes from law enforcement officers who are really tired of corporate criminals who think they're smarter than the justice system. It was like listening to karma finally show up to the party, fashionably late, but ready to make up for lost time. "Police. Search warrant." Detective Morris's voice cut through the house like a knife through butter, and I could hear multiple sets of footsteps spreading out through our first floor with the precision of a military operation. Detective Morris herself stormed past my hiding spot behind the kitchen island like an action hero who'd been waiting her entire career for this moment. She moved with the kind of confidence that comes from having seen this exact scenario play out before, probably multiple times, and knowing exactly how it was going to end. They caught Claudia red-handed in my office, which was pretty much the only way this could have ended. When you're trying to steal corporate secrets while law enforcement is literally breaking down your front door, your options for plausible deniability become somewhat limited. I heard her voice from the office, high-pitched and desperate, trying to explain why she was at her husband's computer while he was supposedly unconscious on the dining room floor. "I was just checking his email," she said, like that was a perfectly normal thing to do while your husband was passed out from mysterious medical episodes. He collapsed, and I thought maybe there was something in his messages that might explain what's been happening to him. Nice try, honey, but Detective Morris had heard my recordings. She knew exactly what Claudia had been doing, and more importantly, she had enough evidence to make charges stick like glue on a kindergarten art project. From my position behind the kitchen island, still feeling like my brain was swimming through chemical soup, I listened to my wife get arrested for systematically poisoning me and stealing my life's work. It was the kind of poetic justice that would have been satisfying if it wasn't also completely terrifying. A few hours later, my kitchen had been transformed into something that looked like a cross between a crime scene and a really depressing coffee shop. There were evidence bags scattered across my granite countertops, police photographers documenting every angle of my dining room disaster, and enough law enforcement personnel to staff a small police station. Detective Morris sat across from me at my own kitchen table, sliding a clear plastic bag across the surface like she was dealing cards in the world's most twisted poker game. "Your wife's phone, the vial, and the USB drive," she said, her voice carrying that matter-of-fact tone that cops use when they're delivering news that's going to rearrange your entire understanding of reality. "We found all of this in her purse, along with about $15,000 in cash and a bank statement showing regular deposits that don't match her employment income." I stared at the evidence bag like it contained artifacts from an alien civilization. The phone was Claudia's. I recognized the case with its little rhinestone pattern that she'd thought was elegant but not ostentatious. The USB drive was generic, the kind you could buy at any electronics store, but knowing it contained months of my work made it look sinister somehow. But it was the vial that really got to me. This tiny glass container, maybe 2 inches tall, had been the instrument of my slow-motion destruction for 3 months. It looked so innocent sitting there in its evidence bag, like something you might use to store perfume samples or homemade vanilla extract. But this little bottle had hijacked my brain, stolen my professional confidence, and nearly destroyed the biggest opportunity of my career. She was getting $6,000 a month, plus a $40,000 bonus from Apex Marketing if she delivered your project before your presentation. Detective Morris continued, consulting her notes like she was reading from a grocery list instead of detailing the financial arrangements of my marital destruction. $6,000 a month, $40,000 bonus. I did the math in my head, which was easier now that my brain wasn't marinating in whatever chemical soup Claudia had been serving up. $46,000 total for 3 months of systematically destroying her husband's life. My wife's loyalty had apparently been for sale, and the going rate was about 15 grand per month of domestic terrorism. "So what you're telling me," I said, trying to keep my voice steady despite the fact that I felt like I'd been hit by a truck carrying a load of betrayal and disbelief, "is that my marriage was worth approximately $15,000 a month to whoever wanted to steal my work?" Detective Morris nodded grimly. Apex Marketing specializes in corporate espionage. They identify key employees at competing firms, find ways to compromise them, and steal proprietary information. Your wife wasn't their first recruit, and she probably wouldn't have been their last. I stared at the vial again, thinking about how something so small had caused so much damage. My sarcastic inner voice, which had been remarkably quiet during the arrest and evidence collection, finally managed to break through. "Wow, Marcus, you're practically on the clearance rack. 46 grand for 3 months of slow-motion attempted murder. That's barely minimum wage when you factor in the risk of federal prison." Dr. Lee chose that moment to arrive, probably because Detective Morris had called him to check on my medical condition after months of systematic poisoning. He took one look at the evidence bags, then at me, and those magnificent eyebrows of his performed their most dramatic expression yet. Pure medical outrage mixed with relief that we'd figured this out before it was too late. "Marcus," he said, settling into the chair next to me and studying my face like he was looking for signs of permanent damage. You're incredibly lucky you figured this out when you did. Long-term exposure to what was in that vial could have caused serious organ damage, permanent neurological problems, maybe even. He gestured vaguely, but I got the message. Good to know, I said deadpan. Next time I'll ask for the low-sodium version of spousal poisoning. Dr. Lee didn't laugh, which was probably appropriate given that we were discussing my wife's attempt to slowly destroy my central nervous system for profit. But Detective Morris cracked a smile, which I took as a good sign that I wasn't completely losing my grip on reality despite everything that had happened. The really twisted part, Detective Morris said, flipping through more pages in her notepad, is how sophisticated this operation was. Apex had been monitoring your career for over a year, waiting for the right opportunity. When you got the Sterling project, they approached your wife through a fake consulting company, convinced her she was just helping with market research, and gradually escalated to full corporate espionage. So Claudia hadn't started out planning to poison me. She'd been recruited, manipulated, probably convinced that what she was doing was just harmless information gathering until she was in too deep to back out. It didn't excuse what she'd done, but it explained how someone I'd trusted enough to marry had ended up serving me chemical cocktails with dinner. What happens now? I asked, because sitting in my kitchen surrounded by evidence of my wife's crimes while trying to process the fact that my marriage had been a business transaction was starting to feel surreal. Now, Detective Morris closed her notepad with a snap. Now your wife goes to federal prison for corporate espionage, assault with a dangerous substance, and probably about 6 other charges my prosecutor friends are going to love. Apex Marketing loses its operating license and faces criminal charges. And you? She paused, studying me with the kind of expression cops get when they're about to deliver news that could go either way. And I get to explain to Sterling Global why I almost missed the biggest presentation of my career because my wife was poisoning me. I finished for her. Actually, Detective Morris said, and for the first time since this whole nightmare began, she smiled like she had good news. I think you're going to find that Sterling Global is very interested in hiring someone who survived corporate espionage and lived to tell about it. Companies like that value employees who can handle industrial-strength betrayal and still show up for work. I had less than 12 hours until the Sterling Global pitch that was supposed to define my career, and everyone, literally everyone, told me I should postpone it. Dr. Lee suggested I needed time to recover from months of chemical exposure. Detective Morris thought I should focus on the criminal case against Claudia. My boss offered to send someone else to handle the presentation while I dealt with my personal situation, which was corporate speak for, while you processed the fact that your wife tried to destroy your brain for money. But here's the thing about surviving systematic poisoning by your spouse. It gives you a very specific kind of clarity about what's actually important in life. And what was important to me was walking into that boardroom and delivering the presentation that Claudia and her corporate handlers had tried so hard to steal. Because I'm Marcus Hale, and I don't just survive domestic chemical warfare, I give PowerPoint presentations after it. So I did what any reasonable person would do after discovering their marriage was actually a 3-month industrial espionage operation. I stayed up all night refining my presentation while running on pure spite and really good coffee. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was finally able to think clearly enough to perfect my work now that my wife was in federal custody instead of in our kitchen preparing chemical cocktails. I sat at my desk, the same desk where Claudia had tried to steal my life's work just hours earlier, and I rebuilt my sterling presentation from the ground up. Every slide, every graph, every strategic recommendation, I made it better than it had ever been. Fueled by the kind of focused rage that comes from realizing someone tried to destroy your career while humming show tunes in the kitchen. The next morning, I walked into that boardroom looking like I'd either conquered the world or survived a small war. Which, technically, I had. The Sterling Global team was there in all their corporate glory. Expensive suits, serious expressions, and the kind of boardroom energy that suggests millions of dollars are about to change hands based on the next hour of conversation. I stood up at the head of that polished conference table, looked at the most important potential clients of my career, and delivered what I now refer to as the presentation that survived spousal sabotage. Every word was sharp, every concept was crystal clear, every strategic insight was delivered with the confidence of someone who'd literally been poisoned for this information and lived to tell about it. This campaign isn't just about reaching your target market. I told them, clicking through slides that represented months of work that had almost been stolen by corporate criminals. It's about creating a brand narrative so compelling that your competitors will wish they'd thought of it first. And trust me, I know something about competitors who'll do anything to get their hands on good ideas. Sterling's CEO, Margaret Chun, leaned forward during my presentation with the kind of attention that suggested I was either about to get the deal of a lifetime or spectacularly crash and burn in front of the most important audience of my career. When I finished, the room was quiet for exactly 3 seconds before she started nodding. "This is brilliant," she said, and I swear those were the most beautiful words I'd ever heard. Even better than, "Your wife has been arrested for corporate espionage." She stood up and extended her hand across the table. "Marcus, when can we start?" 3 months later, the Sterling campaign had exceeded every performance target we'd set, shattered industry benchmarks, and basically turned into the kind of success story that marketing departments write case studies about. I was promoted to vice president, complete with a corner office and the kind of salary that let me finally stop checking my bank balance before buying coffee. Claudia was in federal prison, serving a sentence that would give her plenty of time to think about whether $46,000 was worth destroying someone's life. Apex Marketing had lost their business license, their clients, and their freedom, because it turns out that corporate espionage with a side of spousal poisoning is the kind of thing that really pisses off federal prosecutors. But the best part of this whole twisted story came later, when I started doing speaking engagements about corporate security and domestic betrayal. Because apparently, surviving systematic poisoning by your spouse while foiling an industrial espionage operation makes you the kind of speaker that business conferences love to book. My opening line always gets a laugh. If your spouse suddenly starts cooking gourmet meals after you get a promotion, maybe order takeout instead. The audience thinks it's a joke until I tell them the rest of the story, and then the laughter turns into the kind of uncomfortable silence that means people are mentally reviewing their own relationships for red flags. Now I'm standing in my new corner office, looking out at the city skyline through windows that cost more than most people's cars, and I can honestly say I feel better than I have in years. No dizziness, no confusion, no chemical fog clouding my thoughts. Just me, my work, and a story that turned betrayal into the punchline of my own comeback. Sometimes people ask me if I regret marrying Claudia, if I wish I'd seen the signs earlier, if I'm bitter about what she did. And the truth is, I'm not. Because getting systematically poisoned by your spouse and living to tell about it is the kind of character-building experience that money can't buy. Plus, it makes for one hell of a story at dinner parties, assuming, of course, that someone else is doing the cooking.